my name is Mark Heckler. I'm a developer advocate with Pivotal Software, and I brought back up here, this is my transportable robotics IoT platform. It's a small robot that I built that I can take with me places fairly easily, you know, TSA notwithstanding, from St. Louis, Missouri. And I'm hoping to kind of talk about a few things today here. We'll see how well this cooperates. I did bring some video back up. What you're seeing on the screen, though, is a partial readout. I'll explain some of the sensors that I have on board Trip, as I like to call him, later. But what you're seeing in the bottom left-hand corner is a video feed. And I will bring this out. If anyone wants to get a meta selfie, this is you know, the room. As you can see, the actual video is sort of almost feeding, even though the sensor readings are not. And the directions, when I send it commands, doesn't seem to be working quite well either. But as you can see, it gives a live feedback. You're probably hearing some clicking. That is a Geiger counter. So as long as it's a slow click, we're all okay. No kidding, there's always a little bit of you know, kind of ambient radiation anywhere you go. This picks up beta and gamma rays. So you'll hear a very occasional clicking wherever you are. I actually have some radioactive material that I like to bring where I can locally. I couldn't bring it here. I spoke with the TSA about that too, and they said any radioactive material gets you automatically 5 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. I like you guys, but I kind of like it on the outside better, at least I assume I would, so I did not bring that. But for decades in the US and probably Canada as well, there were tableware and marbles and all kinds of things created out of uranium glass. A slight amount of uranium oxide was put into these things for decoration, for color. And you might find a jar of marbles sitting on an old mantle somewhere that is full of radioactive marbles. And you can buy them off eBay, by the way, if anybody's interested for testing with a robot. And it's kind of fun to do, but again, not recommended for transporting. So, all right, so let's jump into the slides and kind of cover the material. I'm on a tight timetable, so I will be zipping through these. But as with most things, this is kind of just a teaser, and to carry on the conversation afterward, by all means, please do so. I blog semi-regularly at my personal domain. I tweet very regularly, so if you're in the Twitterverse, please look me up. So let's, we visible? We're visible. Okay, great. So this is Trip. Let me back it up here. This is Trip on a good day. He's a little shy, but he's very mobile, very portable. How did I get started with this? A lot of people always say, whatever got you started down this path with this crazy robot? It started with an idea, as all projects do, I suppose. A couple of years ago, a colleague of mine asked me if I would be interested in exploring the possibility of making a drone operate autonomously. And it sounded like a really cool challenge, so I accepted the challenge. And that challenge led me to write a library for autonomous drone operations that served as a basis for a talk I co-presented and as a foundation for a chapter in this book, just released the end of last year. However, as with all good ideas, there are some sharp edges, and flying drones have a lot of sharp edges. My wife was kind enough to let me convert our living room into a test flight facility. I hear laughter, so there are apparently a lot of people with very patient wives in the audience, or husbands. There were times it wasn't so pretty. I found that blades on a drone can really do a number on fingers. They can also do a number on houseplants. I have a lot of interesting stories about out-of-control flights, so if you want to, look me up later and we'll talk about it. But it kind of got me thinking there must be a better way, a less house-destructive way to test these concepts and functions. So it occurred to me that I was working out these concepts on one of the more complicated variants of drones. And this is a consistent theme. Not that I do things the hard way, that's the wrong lesson to take from this. But you get a lot further with problems if you decompose them and start at a simpler level and then recompose them to accomplish the original goal or goals. And drones that operate in 2 dimensions should be simpler to control, at least in theory, than drones that operate in 3 dimensions, right? Land-based drones and surface drones on water operate in the X and Y planes. But when you add that Z plane with air and underwater drones, you're adding quite a lot of complexity. So I took the Autonomous4J library that I'd written and worked on some abstractions to help it apply across all types of drones with the goal of making a single consistent API and hopefully someday enabling it to extend even further to cooperative efforts among drones, swarm ops. That's kind of how that got started. And along the way, I had the privilege of co-presenting a session with James Gosling at a conference. And I don't know, anyone know who James Gosling is? Father of Java, chief software architect, Liquid Robotics. I actually had a chance to chat with him about a half an hour before the session started and just pick his brain one-on-one. It was really, really great. Liquid Robotics developed and maintains a fleet of robotic ocean-going drones. So they're self-powering. They operate independently via satellite connections. And, it was kind of some things that I wanted to talk about, concepts, and ask him about. So I mentioned what I was kind of thinking and what I was planning on doing, and I asked him if it were possible to create a valid test platform at a much smaller level, kind of in the small, and then build lessons up from there and scale them up. And his answer was something along the lines of, why not? We started with a small surfboard in a bathtub. So, here's this company that's kind of a global leading edge robotics company, and they started with a small floaty in a bathtub. So I found that somewhat encouraging. So the purpose of this talk, and why do we really go to conferences? We really don't go to be impressed. We go to be inspired. We go to pick up tidbits that we can start to think about and learn and grow and do and see where we can take these concepts. So if there's one thing you take away from this, I want you to take away that you can do this. There are a lot of really cool things you can do with robotics, even if your background is not entirely aligned with the robotics field. So let's take a look first at the field of robotics from the perspective of a professional roboticist. These are photos of a highly automated automotive assembly line, all run by robots. Boston Dynamics, which is now a part of Google or Alphabet or whatever we're calling it this week. And the bottom center one is from the Dynamic Robotics Lab at Oregon State University, which is partnered with DARPA, NSF, and various other 3- and 4-letter agencies. I don't know, has anybody been following the news this week? Boston Dynamics Atlas robot? Oh yeah, this is 2 days ago, just 2 days ago. They released a really cool video of this. Let's see if I can well, it's too far away to point. But the upper right-hand photo, the second from the left, that's Atlas. And they took the really cool video of him inside and outside maneuvering and adapting and being knocked around by a guy with a hockey stick. And this is how the robot revolution will start, folks. We're just ticking them off. But it was a really good video, and it's really representative of where the state of professional robotics is going. But those take some deep pockets. I mean, Boston Dynamics is not a tiny company with a shoestring budget. But let's take a look at some of the amateur roboticists' results and things available to the amateur robotic crowd. It's actually probably more varied than professional robotics. It's easy to get started, even for kids with some adult supervision, of course. There are all kinds of kits and competitions and crowdsourcing campaigns and nav contests. Just kind of around the horn here, you see an Arduino robotics kit that you can buy feature complete and put together. You see a Lego robot that kids build and compete with. A small Robo Sapiens robotics toy. Yes, toy, but still enable or embody some robotics concepts. Down in the bottom right, you have a robotic arm, which is used to manipulate and move objects. And in the center, you have a servo-based robot, which is used to solve the Rubik's Cube. So there's some programming involved with that, as well as some motor functions. So kind of cool. And amateur robotics is kind of a big deal. Anyone been to a FIRST competition? They're huge. They're really a big deal globally. They're advancing the state of the art. They're sharpening young minds. And they're creating a lot more scrap metal, so it's just kind of a win-win-win all the way around. But they're doing their part for education and recycling, so that's a huge plus. But at this point, I kind of want to step back and look at what can an amateur contribute? Because a lot of times I talk with folks and they're like, yeah, but it's not my field. How can I get involved? Or how do I ward off the coming robotic apocalypse? And I always go back to amateur. When you look at the definition of amateur, what does it mean? An amateur is just someone who engages in a pursuit on an unpaid basis. That's it. There's no judgment involved in that. Does anyone here contribute to open source on their own time? You know what that makes you? Yes. And that's not a bad thing. That doesn't mean you throw your professionalism out the window. It just means in that particular context, you're an amateur. So, big deal, right? Now, I'm no golfer. Let's see. Yeah, that showed it all. Okay. I'm not even that into sports, quite frankly, but I love history. So history is a cool thing. And we can learn from a lot of different domains. This photo is from one of my favorite examples. It's from the 1913 U.S. Golf Open Championship, the first time an amateur had ever won the U.S. Open. And note that the honorific, Mr. was only used for the amateur. Mr. Francis Ouimet, and he grew up in Brookline, Massachusetts. That's his pronunciation. But at one point, someone who excelled at something, but wasn't paid to excel at that specific something, was held in very high regard. Only male, obviously, amateurs were regarded as Mr. The professionals who were paid to do that weren't held in that same regard. So lest anyone think it was due to wealth or status, young Mr. Ouimet was the fifth child born to immigrant parents. So it was a very poor family, and yet he was held with such regard because he did something extremely well and wasn't paid to do that something. So I'm going to get a little geeky with etymology here. The word amateur can be traced back to its Latin roots, meaning to love, and that's really what we're talking about here. It has nothing to do with skill. It's wanting to do something and do it well. So let's look at some other amateurs in other fields. Has anyone ever heard of the Cadison-Singer problem? This is a huge mathematical problem, formerly untractable, for over 50 years it was unsolvable by some of the best minds in mathematics throughout the world. And at some point, a few years ago, a CS professor looked at it and thought, this kind of, I guess he was talking with his colleague in the mathematics department, and it was telling him about his network sparsification studies. And his colleague thought, this sounds like it has some interesting parallels. So they talked it out, and the CS prof thought, I could spend a few weeks on this. So he pulled in a couple of grad students, and it took them 5 years, but they solved a problem that cuts across several higher-level mathematics domains in which they had very little expertise themselves. So you can make some really big contributions and accomplishments even outside of your field. Another great field to point to is astronomy. There are all kinds of great accomplishments made by amateur astronomers. And some actually moved from amateur status to professional status. William Herschel, on the left, was a middle-class musician when he discovered the planet Uranus in 1781. And of course, attracted the attention of the scientific community, was put on payroll by King George III, and the rest is history. He also, by the way, coined the term photography and positive and negative in the development process, and made several contributions to that field as well. So the guy was obviously no slouch. Reverend Robert Evans from Australia is credited with the highest number of supernovas, recognizing the highest number of supernovas of anyone globally. He has an eidetic memory, and he has memorized over 1,500 galaxies and can detect changes just by looking at them through his telescope. But he's an amateur. He's had a huge impact on the field. My favorite example is David Levy over here on the far right. He was born right here in Montreal in 1948. He received bachelor's and master's degree in English literature. English lit. I have a daughter who's studying English lit. And he co-discovered the Shoemaker-Levy comet, has co-discovered several other comets, was the only discoverer of a couple comets, and at the time he was an amateur astronomer and science writer. So he's made a huge lasting contribution to his field, even when he wasn't a real key part of that field. So the one big takeaway is that we're all professionals in some domains, and we're all amateurs in some domains. So whatever you want to do in this field or any other, you can do it. And of course, I lean toward robotics. So let me give you kind of a brief run through of how I built TRIP, kind of some of the components on board, talk a little bit about the software. We'll see if we get a little better connection, and we'll take it from there. At a very basic level, you have some motors that handle the propulsion, motor driver board. The servo is showing there, which really has nothing to do with the propulsion, but it's visible there, so I pointed out. It handles the proximity detector, which reports the distance front and sides in centimeters. Let's see. Try to speed through this a little bit. Microcontroller interfaces with all the onboard sensors and the motors via a sensor shield. Have a triple axis magnetometer on board so you can get 3 planes of direction and bearing. Servo mount proximity sensor. At this point, what we've discussed is solely on board. We also need a way to communicate. So I added a small onboard computer, a Raspberry Pi, with a voltage regulator, a Pi camera so we can get a first-person perspective even as we navigate him through things, and put it all on a first tier, a Lexan tier to lift it up, so for visibility. Here's kind of a look at the insides and outsides. I'm trying to zip through this a little bit more quickly to get to the fun part. A Geiger counter. Why a Geiger counter? Everybody's heard of the Fukushima disaster. I think that brings it to mind a lot more so than what we might have thought before. But there's always a little bit of ambient radiation everywhere. But sometimes you want to know if you're going into a building, if you have workplace environmental concerns. And there are a lot of different readings and sensors that you can apply to the problem domain. But a Geiger counter was just kind of an interesting and useful addition to the robot. This will actually pick up beta and gamma radiation, and again, you can test it on various things to make sure it works. I find it to be somewhat useful. Even at a very small scale, you can build something like this that has a lot of applicability, and of course, if you scale that up to a professional level, you can take it into hotspots, obvious hotspots, and sense that as well. The software on board, and it's interfacing with, whoops, I just skipped ahead. Everything is web-based. I have a cloud-based system that will allow the tracking and analysis of radiation readings as well as ambient sensors. And what that allows you to do, because as with all, and this is basically a mobile Internet of Things platform, it does you little good if you can't gather the data and analyze it and act upon it. So you obviously need some kind of a cloud backend that you can gather this information and act upon it. So anybody here do front end, back end, enterprise development? Yeah. So you're a lot closer to this than you realize, because this is, in effect, a bundle of front end sensors that you're going to need to gather the data from and act on. You have a lot of expertise in related areas that you can bring to bear on the problem at hand. So in summary, because I don't want to run into the next segment here, be a professional. Whatever you do, do it the best you can, and leverage that skill set, that knowledge set, to new domains. Robotics is an exciting field that you can contribute to as well and learn and grow from and give back to your community and help advance the cause in a responsible way. As you learn, share it. Because when you take things that I do and then share them, your advancements, and then I take things that you do, we all build, we advance the field faster, and again, we do so in a responsible way. This is kind of a key time to be in the field, and this is something that you can help influence as you go forward. Robotics is fun. It's a fun and frustrating line of work. It's a fun and useful avocation. Get involved. You'll appreciate the things that you can do with it and that it helps you to do. You can advance the field. Every one of you can advance this field. Yes, you. So thank you very much for attending. All code is out on my GitHub repo, so by all means, if you're interested in taking a peek, pulling it down, and advancing it and making it better, by all means, please do so. Would love to have the cooperation. Thanks.